we're gonna get started. Last session of the day. So I'm really actually, normally I don't like the last session of the day because everybody's kind of sleepy. You know, you're ready to get out of here. For what I want to talk about today, I'm kind of excited it's the last session because I'm not really sure what I'm doing today. I'll talk more about that in a second. But I'm really wanting this to be discussion and conversation as much as anything. So feel free to interrupt, throw your hand up, throw a question out, whatever. Obviously, everybody's been saying this all day, but if you've enjoyed today, do the event and the sponsors a favor. Go check them out. Say thanks on LinkedIn. Whatever you can do to kind of help get the name out so that they want to sponsor the next event too. Because as we all know, sponsors love to get the attention that they're trying to get out of the sponsorship. So again, kind of lofty conversation. You guys have heard a bunch of stuff today about product management. You probably heard a bunch of stuff about AI, et cetera. And you know, my thought is, as I said in the pitch, is much about this idea of what are we doing beyond cost savings, right? So much of AI right now is I can make things faster. I can save headcount. I can save staff. But then what, right? Because we don't grow businesses. We don't make successful products based on not doing things. We do it based on doing things. So I want to talk a little bit about that idea of how do we do more things today. Before I forget, if you want the slides from today, connect with me on LinkedIn. I also run 2 events you can check out, small group fun events where it's virtual 2 hours of conversation about CX issues, product, community, support, success, but also about AI as well. Tons of fun, totally free. Check them out if you're interested. So as I mentioned, this is my big warning to start us off. I don't really know what I'm talking about because I don't think anybody knows what we're talking about in this idea of what do we do when AI is really, you know, working for us and doing good things. And that's, again, why I want to have a discussion. So if something prompts an idea or you feel like I'm off base or something, let's talk about it, because I really came up with this idea as part of another conversation with somebody about a week ago. And it started to snowball in my head, and I thought last minute, maybe I can still get a speaker pitch in and have some of this discussion and help me form it up. So, you know, again, we talk a lot about AI as process automation and staff reduction and cost savings. I don't get excited about that. I don't know who else. Maybe there's some logistics folks in the room that get super excited when you start talking about, you know, cost savings and staff reductions, and they go, "My God, that's the best stuff." But I don't know about you, but most product people aren't here to do that sort of work. It's to create something remarkable and emotional and interesting. But the AI stuff is really important. We're doing a lot of amazing things with it, right? Stuff like financial process automation to make fraud detection much faster. In one of my AI sessions events, we recently had an attendee who works at Ballet Austin here in town, and they're using AI and trying to improve their overall data so that they can start noticing trends for people that are going in and buying up big blocks of tickets and then scalping them, right? And starting to find those behaviors. So, you know, very important type of stuff. And, you know, we have limited time, so I won't go into more depth, but we all know some of these things, right? That, you know, the analysis piece, the optimization piece, the forecasting pieces, all very important, right? Very good stuff if you're in those teams, but nobody except the bean counters or executives who are looking at quarterly stock prices say, "Wow, we've got cost savings," right? It just doesn't happen. There's no, you know, automation, staff reduction, efficiencies. Oh my, this is so good. But it doesn't create, in and of itself, it doesn't create innovation. It doesn't really grow the business. It helps make the business healthier, but it doesn't grow the business. The fact that we can do fraud detection doesn't inherently grow the business, right? It saves the business from having problems, which can be good down the road. But, you know, we're not really creating deeper customer loyalty. We're not doing better customer satisfaction because our internal processes are better. So how do we get to that point where we're doing better stuff? And I think that, you know, this is my premise. This was the conversation over beers the other day with a buddy of mine, where we were getting philosophical. You know, the biggest opportunity companies have in implementing AI is on the simple stuff in order to reinvest resources in other parts of the business, right? how do we take cost savings that are happening, that we're making happen in all parts of the business, and how do we holistically think as an organization how to redirect and reinvest those cost savings somewhere else, right? And again, in order to reinvest resources, this is the part that's really, at least for me, is sticking out. How do we allow ourselves more creativity and more space to grow and run and experiment? Because now in theory, we've got more cash on hand to redirect somewhere else. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the difficulty of that in a second. But let me pause there for a second. Actually, let me go back to this. And again, this is all still discussion. The small philosophical discussion we're having here. How does that feel when I'm talking about that idea of reinvesting in the creative stuff? Any first responses? Any reactions? I will call on people too if you don't raise hands. You might as well just go ahead and raise hands. What do you think? What are you feeling?
I would say yes. Like, I understand this idea, it's close to me, but on the other hand, maybe we still need to invest in AI itself to reduce something, reduce costs and something else. So, yes, it helps to give some creative stuff, but maybe not always creative stuff is something that we need to consider. Sometimes for some businesses, it's much more important to be more focused on revenue, cost savings, and everything. But in general, this idea looks great.
Yeah, and I'll throw out an idea that if the business needs to, and I'm using that word "need to" very specifically right now, if it needs to focus on revenue, efficiencies, that sort of thing, there's problems in the business, right? With the fundamental business itself, I think we always need to be thinking about innovation and growth, customer loyalty, customer satisfaction, because that helps us to get to revenue without having to put this major focus on driving revenue, right? People are coming to us, we don't have to send as many salespeople out, right?
We're in a phase. In a phased approach, the first phase was, can we use AI to automate some of the things that we use for its considerable productivity? I think we're moving a little bit more into how do we use AI to actually spend more time on the things which have more value. Might be creative, might not be creative. So, the problem right now is the gap is like lots of companies have problems to work with AI. It's actually less implementing AI. The data is actually showing that there's actually a pushback right now.
Yeah.
But the truth is, at the end of the day, AI will still improve some jobs.
Well, and I also think that to your point about there's all these grand promises, this list, I don't know, to somebody like me who, and I say creative in a very broad sense, right? Innovation, engagement, all that's a creative focus. But for a creative person like me, this stuff, it seems important, but it seems kind of dull too, right? The cleaner balance sheets are maybe really important to the business, but it doesn't drive my emotions, right? Which is part of the challenge, is that so many people have been sold on these really grand ideas before we've gotten through any connection to the reality of what we really need right now, right? Yeah, sorry.
Unfortunately, I think you're hitting on the challenge between assessing the value of the tangible versus the intangible. This is a list of very tangible, I can count the dollars and I can say if I do it, versus the intangible idea, maybe possible, of what I could do in the future on the creativity side. In the business world, the tangible almost always lives over the intangible.
It almost always does, for several reasons, one of which is the people that are trying to sell the intangible are almost always horrible at it, right?
That could be too.
It is really easy to walk into a CEO whose main focus is stock price quarterly and say, I can improve the stock price quarterly by a small amount. One of my favorite business stories of all time is a buddy of mine was in a meeting that Steve Ballmer was in, right, when he was running Microsoft. And the head of the office team came and said, we're having this major problem with piracy. I have this ability to stop piracy cold in its tracks by implementing this thing that whatever it was on the Office suite. And Ballmer said, that sounds great. But if you lose even, I don't know, it was some insignificant number, 0.0001% of stock price, you're fired. Right? That was a real conversation had in the highest levels of Microsoft about addressing a real problem. And of course, the VP went, well, I can't promise that, so we're not going to do that, right? There wasn't a sales process involved in that to see why that would actually yield more money in the long run. He just got scared and said, okay, fine, never mind, right? So, but what you're tapping into is what I'm going to talk about in a second. This idea of, sure, this sounds great, but how do we do it? So let me come back to that in a second. The three areas that I think a lot about when I think about this, okay, so we have implemented a process. It has saved X number of dollars this year, this quarter, whatever. How do we reinvest that? Where do we reinvest that? What are the kind of things we're talking about, right, when we're talking about this creative pursuit? And the three pieces for me are innovation. So how do we, let me just go to this, fueling innovation, right? So how do we go to changing the capacity that we have for risk taking, right? Because right now, part of the reason we don't take the big risks is because financially, right? We don't have the budgets to just go out and try skunkworks stuff the same way we did before. But if you start saving a bunch of money in one part of the business, maybe that money can get redirected into taking bigger risks, right? Whether that's a moonshot idea, new market segments, new trials, whatever it might be. That's one option. The other option is prototyping at scale. So how do we do more prototyping, but at much larger footprints, right? So instead of doing small tests, put it out to the market, hope it works well. How are we doing much bigger prototyping type of activities that cost money that we may now have, right, through this reinvestment? Another one is just the resource allocation. So how do we really think about which new technologies to try and experiment with, where to take from. Again, I'm kind of thinking about it as the AI savings slush fund. How do we take that and move that somewhere else into bigger initiatives that we want to put more support behind? How many times have you said, man, if only this thing had a little bit more money, we could do really great things with it, but we've come so close and failed because we just didn't have the funding for it, right? And part of that's because of prioritization. We only have so much we can do. Is this a conversation now to start saying we can be doing more strategic things if we can move some of these freed up resources over? As a long-term community guy who's spent a career building community and direct-to-consumer engagement programs, this one's close to home for me. How do we start to spend more time and energy getting people involved, right? I was in the strategy session next door this last time around. I don't know who was in that one, but when you put up the business canvas framework and a couple of the other frameworks, my mind immediately said, there's no customer voice in this, right? There's an assumption of clarity about the problem line, that we did all the research in just the right way and just the level of depth we needed to do to make that problem absolutely correct, absolutely valuable to customers. But that's a big damn assumption, right? That is a big assumption. And how do we start to pull in programs, spend more time getting people out into customer environments, right? How do you hire more community managers? How do you put more community programs in place? How do you bring more customers into your product design cycles, right? And then things like the personalized customer experiences. So, how do we start to really think more about, investing in whether everything from mass customization to just more direct sales to all kinds of other things that we can do and engage. And then the proactive customer support piece, right? So how do we keep people on the phones? Not how do we say we're going to reduce staff because AI, and every time you call up, you're talking to a chatbot who maybe gets it halfway decent. Okay. But what if we were to take some of the savings from what we're doing with AI to make sure that first tier of support is much faster based on AI. How do we take the second tier of support and say, how are the humans empowered by AI? And how do we then take a third level of support that is much more humanistic, that we can't afford right now, right? Because we're putting it all into those first tiers of just getting people off the phones for the most simple, basic stuff. When I ran the Apple global support community for a while, and it was always fascinating to talk to the leaders of the support community, for the customer service team that dealt with the phones, because their number one metric was call deflection. How do we make them not call us, right? And it makes sense, right? Calls are expensive, they're repetitive, very often, much of the content's repetitive. If we could push all that into knowledge base, into Twitter support, into online community support, peer-to-peer engagement, then that whole expensive phone tier at that level one goes away. We save money. That's great. And I always tried to explain that the problem with that is that as soon as you put a lot of that stuff off, especially with complex products, as soon as you start pushing off those engagements to peer-to-peer support, and it works, what happens? People start using the products more. They start getting more complex in their usage. And they start getting well past what peers are able to do because they just don't have access to the knowledge base, to the experience that person's trying. They may be using a product in a way nobody's ever done before at a much more complex level. Or they don't have access to the internal tools to look up your account and that sort of thing, right? So it's not about call deflection. In fact, it may actually increase calls. But what happens? Better customer loyalty. Not just better, but maybe deep. Like, how long have I been on iPhone despite the fact that there's been other stuff in the Android world at times that made me go, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that. I'm still here. I'm not even thinking about moving, right? That's not loyalty, right? That's obsession in a way, right? We get to that point of creating different experiences and completely different types of support. And then this is the most exciting to me, I think, is the funding bold experiments. This is where we don't really have the safety, often because of financial reasons. Because what's really safety when we talk about financial reasons, that's risk, right? Everybody in a business environment is risk averse. Full stop. That's just a function of how we get by. That same, the VP of Microsoft making, the Microsoft Office team making God knows how much money is just as risk averse, if not more so, than everyone in this room when it comes to making decisions that might impact their career, right?
Oh yeah, so going back to that story actually, I know that software, I think that guy was trying to pitch to Steve Ballmer, it's basically the CRM software, prevent piracy. So my thought is that when it comes to this use case, so many of these risk averse companies and the people that are leading these companies, it's because they don't ever want to be the first business to try this. So if you can point to at least one example, something similar enough, then that's your stepping stone to, hey, we can push this initiative, we can invest these resources, and then maybe pick something new or have some new initiative.
Yeah, one response, and then I'll get to your question. I think you're absolutely right. I think every company is risk averse. It's the question of level of risk aversity. I also think that in a lot of ways the risk is an effect of not just not wanting to be the first, but nobody wants to be the person that reset the no accidents since counter on the shop floor, right? And the longer that goes on, the more difficult it gets to take a risk enough that you might reset that counter. Because if it just happened yesterday, well, I mean, it's clearly not a big issue. If it's been 14 years, nobody wants to step into that water, right? But now all of a sudden, we've got enough funding to actually go try some experiments. And we'll talk about what needs to happen to make this actually possible. But there's some cultural backup, some executive support, some money that backs that up. All of a sudden, there's not as much risk involved, right? Good.
So one thing I'm not seeing or not hearing you say is how do we reduce the risk through advanced machine learning? In other words, instead of trying something out actually in the market, try it out in a model of the market, a simulator of it.
Sure.
And so the challenge has always been, how do you build a model of an extremely complex multivariate system? This is the reason why predicting the weather more than a few days out is, because you have a complex multivariate system with a tremendous number of interactions that are very difficult to model. And we won't get really good long-term weather predictions until we actually predict the weather using quantum computing, for example. But we can already build better models today with the computing power we have. Can you comment on that? How we can reduce the risk of experiments by using better simulation models?
So I'll say two things. One is, I think you said it great. I don't know that I need to add a whole lot more to that for the moment. I think the other thing I'll say is I specifically tried to stay away from that for this particular conversation that's short and that I wanted to have a conversation for. Because what I'm trying to say is, if you just, right now, to your point, there's stages we're going through. We're not there yet, right? Nobody's got a quantum computer we can actually do this with. We don't have models enough on mass to apply that as a standard. What we do have is AI that can immediately start getting implemented at the smaller stuff. And now from a business standpoint, not a technology standpoint, how do we rethink shoving that over in different ways? Go ahead.
Where I'm not disagreeing, but I'm struggling a little bit. This is based on the assumption that if AI saves us, let's say $1 billion, we're going to repurpose that $1 billion to something else.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm like, that's great on paper. I don't think that's what's happening in reality.
It's not what's happening in reality, but I.
It's going to value this because you will always be running a business. So regardless of whether you're a $5 million or $5 billion business, you're always going to be limited by the number of resources you have. You're always be looking at growing your business. There's new business that are trying to grow, and it's going to be a resource allocation. So I think for me, it's more about, it's good to help. The opportunity is less in terms of, because I don't believe that a CFO will say, hey, great, you saved $1 million, put it back here. No, the CFO is going to say, you saved $1 million, go and find me another $1 million. This is what's the world.
But I think that, so this is the challenge. I want to knock through a couple more things. I know it didn't interrupt me. I'm gonna throw you a couple of pieces of information because this is the point, right? I don't disagree with what you're saying. That's the problem, is what you're saying, right? That the CFO is in charge of business growth in so many companies. But right.
One key issue though is timing. There are times in the economy when you don't go pitch a new idea to the CEO or the executive team. You go pitch cost savings, and you're much more likely to win. But there's also times when you've come out of the doldrums and you're on the rise. Now's the time to go pitch the new opportunity. Timing is an important piece of this. If you save some money, great. Maybe now's the time to be focusing on saving money. But don't forget, there's going to come a time when it's time to grow.
Yeah, and we're going to run out of time, unfortunately. But this is the whole point of this presentation, is this concept. I don't even want to say the presentation, but the discussion is about moving to how are we doing better jobs at selling this stuff, right? How are we getting, and so I worked at Lego right before or during the period of time when they were doing marginal to almost hit bankruptcy to recovering. That process, the reason they almost hit bankruptcy, if you had to pick one thing, was because they put a COO who was well known in the world for slashing everything to reform companies that were struggling. They put him in charge. And it was great at first, and then just tanked as far as long-term viability, because cost savings only get you so far. Business growth doesn't come from slashing costs. So the question is, how do we start to, we in this room as product managers who have ideas, who have these things, how do we start to figure out how to sell these ideas that it's not just okay, great, we can erase $1 million of cost savings and give you the next $1 million and keep going, because you don't build a business that way. We can build it with doing great, wonderful things. So again, this won't be easy. We know this. There's cultural resistance to change, skills gap and talent shortages. It's great to say we're gonna redirect all this stuff, but what if you redirect it into an idea that doesn't have any staffing or nobody you can upskill, right? And those are real issues right now, especially integration with the existing system and processes, misalignment and goals between teams, all these things. But I do think there's some of these things that we can start to get around. These are just some of the things I think we need to make something like this possible. One is we actually have to have a strategic vision for, and coming from top down, for what AI reinvestment looks like, what that means, how we're going to implement it. We're starting to talk a little bit, I think, and I'm saying we as in the business culture, we're starting to talk a little bit about how AI gets implemented in companies, but it's still coming driven by a CTO about technology for cost savings, right? So how do we start to get into this idea of stepping up and saying to our product organization, we want to be involved in that conversation, and here's why, right? Here's the vision of what can happen beyond cost savings that can be really amazing, right? But there is a lot of stuff that is involved with this, the clear metrics, the transparency, and I think the takeaway I want you guys to really come out of this session with is, what's my role in this, right? As a product person, which I'm assuming we're all product people here because we're at Product Camp, as a product person, how can I start to think about selling in this vision? I cannot tell you, and I've been doing consulting for a long time. Somebody just asked me and I added it up. It's like 15 years cumulative. I've worked at companies that are huge. And I cannot tell you the amount of times where an executive has said to somebody who's come in and said, we should do a thing. And they go, great, give me an idea for a project. And they go, oh, let me get back to you in a week. I mean, Jesus, you just had somebody give you a silver platter opportunity and you weren't ready for it, right? What are your experiments? What are your bold choices that you want to make? If you had money, right? We always talk about this idea, if I waved a magic wand. Well, you may have a magic wand to wave. You better sure as hell be ready to say what wish you want when you're waving it, right? And have those things in your back pocket at the ready. Start socializing those, right? Start talking about those on a daily basis. Start planting the seeds, not just for the company's growth, but your own growth, right? If you start to become seen as the person who has these interesting and revolutionary ideas, and you're doing a good job of seeding them, of talking about them, of trying to integrate them where you can here and there, because even if the company doesn't have a long-term vision, you do, right? There's some real power in that, both for your own career and your product and the company you're working on growing. So I know we're about to run out of time, but I had questions for you guys, but if we can get to those. I know there was a couple of hands that went up. I think yours was one of them. What you got?
I got two comments or questions. First, we were discussing and touching on reinvesting the dividends which we are getting from here, which is good. First thing, my sense, my observations is we haven't yet realized the gains. We haven't made those savings to reinvest into the new things, and everyone is waiting for those things to realize. I can tell you from my experience, we were in the cost saving and we were going into the revenue optimization, revenue increase models, but we haven't realized those gains. We will, but it will take time. But it's not the time right now. We haven't. That's the first thing. And
well, so let me pause you there. I'm going to fundamentally disagree. It's not the time. I'm a strategy guy, and so I think about things in longer term cycles, right? Just generally speaking, that's where my mind goes. It's not what are we doing today. It's the dream for tomorrow, right?
3 years down the line, 5 years down the line.
It is, and I totally understand and agree that there's a lot of discussion about cost savings. We're seeing some here and there. We're seeing a lot of costs being spent to get those cost savings. I understand all of that. But salesmanship isn't about waiting until somebody's already past a point of setting patterns to try and change the pattern, right? The best time we can be selling is right now because none of that's been done, because none of that is in there. Because if you can go into your executives and say, right now, we're working on implementing this, which will allow us to get this, you're already planting seeds. So that when that does come around, there's almost a given that this is going to be a good idea because you've been saying it all along, right? Because the team has been saying it all along. If cost savings goes in, the CFO comes in and takes over, says you got $1 million of savings, that's wonderful. His next first step is going to be, her next first step is going to sound like, what's the next million? Exactly what you said, Virgin. You want to try and cut that off, right?
And maybe I'm still trying to picture it's like you're talking more about large corporations versus small corporations.
I think it's both.
First, I would never talk about cost saving, I would talk about efficiency. Because that's
Right.
efficiency, right? It's like say marketing to cost center. If you say marketing is a revenue generator, it changes the conversation. So it's all about efficiency. I do agree that I think right now countries have not yet really seen the value or completely realized the value they can get from AI because they've spent actually a lot of resources into it, and they're kind of saying, hey, well, it's taking a lot of our efforts, and we're not seeing enough of ROI. So I do agree with you. At the same time, saying it's great to say, hey, in the future, like with AI, for instance, it's not about improving existing process; it's actually for changing the process. But there's a reality of like, yes, great. That's 5 years down the road. We have to do something today as well.
Yeah. And
Tension between, well, yeah, you can be a dreamer, right?
but I don't think it's, so this is where, yeah, go ahead. Well, I think it's important to not think about it as dreams.
Positioning, I say, look, this is your vision long term. But the reality is that you have to position for what you have today. You can, the positioning needs to go in a direction that will align with the long term vision. So the long term is important, and studying the why is important. But I think that's why I'm not disagreeing with it. When you're in the middle and you're day to day and you're like an executive at any company, there is still going to be the, okay, that's great, I get it, where you want to go, but right now, we need.
Yeah, I would also, this is, who was here in April?
I want to bridge with one more.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we're almost out of time, but go ahead.
All discussion is all about the cost saving. Unless we pitch the AI for revenue generation, unless we pitch how can we get more customer, how can we get more repeat customer, how can we get cross customers or more sales, we will be very short-handed.
Yeah, agreed.
But it's not about revenue, right? It's about efficiency. You talk about go-to-market efficiency. This is what every company right now is talking about. You bring under that umbrella, you're going to it's not cost saving on one side, it's not revenue because that's the too extreme. It's efficiency, and efficiency can be cost saving. Efficiency.
So since we're at time, one last question. Anybody have one last thing to add, or I'll close this out otherwise.
Question about the innovation as well.
Sorry, hang on one sec. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. Go ahead.
It feels like one way to solve this would be to have more stories about how taking risks and innovating has really paid off. So when they made the change at Lego and brought someone else in, who I assume was more into taking risks, like is that a story that you could share about how that change is made?
Yeah, in fact, so the very quick version of that is that they fired Paul Plowman. I don't mind saying his name because he was just an awful person in general, but he was. They called him the smiling killer in Denmark because of his tendency to walk down the hall and just say, "Hey, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired," like literally. And that was the kind of cost savings mindset that he was in. When he was gone, they replaced him with a guy named Jorn V. Knudsen, who at the time was 35. He had a great resume, but was very young relative to most CEOs of companies that size. And he immediately understood that it wasn't about cost savings. It was about emotion and excitement and enthusiasm for the product. And he didn't just take big risks. He reprioritized into stuff that had a deeper emotional connection and took more risks. And we see that now with, the business is printing money at this point, but in no small part because of that strategy of saying, we're going to try new things. We're going to focus on really understanding what the problem is, not what we want it to be, and bringing in customers into the process in a much deeper, much more direct kind of way. But again, all of this is up for debate. Everything, you're not saying anything incorrect. You're not saying anything I disagree with. But I think at the end of the day, the question is, how can we take more control in the product strategy, in the product process, as product people, to keep starting now, starting today, because we don't want to wait until things are solidified to try and then chip away the concrete and plant something new in it, right? When the concrete's wet, that's the best time to put the rebar in. Actually, it's the best time to put rebar in is before you put the concrete down, right? It's very difficult to make fixes and changes, and they're patched together and they don't work very well after the concrete's set up. And I think that's the point we're at now, is really thinking about what's our power as product people to change how this works for ourselves and our work, for our careers, and also the companies we work with, products we work on.
So when I have to explain why I spent $1,000 on my son's wedding.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
So I believe it's important that if you want to approach your management, top management about the opportunities of AI, is to know how you tie up a small opportunity to the value chain of the organization. How these small projects can be approached through AI in a hybrid way and presented like Lean Six Sigma project. This is the problem statement. This is what is the opportunity, and this is what we propose to solve it in different pockets of the organization and see how that tied up to the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're way over time. Thank you guys for staying extra time. If you have any questions, let me know. And there is the info if you want to connect later. Thank you.